What's up, everybody? It's Anthony Cosenza with the Orange and Black Insider. How are you? Hopefully, you're doing better than the Bengals are at this point, and hopefully, you all had a good holiday. We took the week off last week because of the Thanksgiving holiday. We record Wednesday nights, so it was a little difficult with travel and family in town and all that good stuff. But I hope you all enjoyed your holiday. I think we all did on our end as well, despite the Bengals on a 2-game losing streak here. Scott Schulte is joining me. Scott, how was your Thanksgiving? Doing anything special?
We kind of stayed local, but it was definitely better than the Bengals. I think they're like 0-2 since we last had one of these, so it's about time we got back online.
Right, right. And Connor Howe is with us as well. Connor, do anything special for your Thanksgiving? I think we were talking before. You kind of stayed local as well, but do anything fun over the weekend?
Just hanging out with family and friends. Got to go to my uncle's place, and he has an ocean view, so that was nice to eat some turkey and watch the surfers surf. So that's pretty cool.
You just watched, huh? You didn't actually get out in the water?
I used to surf, but I'm not really that big into it anymore.
All right. All right. Well, since we were last took the air, the Bengals have played 2 games, one at home against the Buffalo Bills and one on the road against the Baltimore Ravens. And both were basically must-win games, as the Bengals were at the time before we last recorded 3-5-1. And now, unfortunately, they are 3-7-1 and all but out of playoff contention. And probably looking to 2017. There are a myriad of issues, but still a lot of talent on this roster. We're going to talk about a lot of items tonight. The first, we're going to kind of talk about the 2 games that they lost, the Bills game and the Ravens game. And aside from kind of going, our biggest disappointments and those who impressed and all that stuff, which we normally do, there's 2 kind of big topics here with those games and how the result played out. And one of which is the effect of A.J. Green. He went out on the very first offensive series for the Bengals with a hamstring injury. It initially seemed like it was something that was going to end his season. Now he's kind of week to week. Sounds like he might come back later in the year, but with the season being all but lost at this point, we don't know. But Connor, I'll start with you. Your thoughts on the offense without A.J. Green, and maybe not only the impact, but also the other guys stepping up or maybe not stepping up in his absence.
Yeah, you talk about the offense, and as we all know, the offense has not played well without AJ Green. That being said, it wasn't playing well with AJ Green. So you're going to see all the media talking about how AJ Green and Giovanni Bernard getting hurt has been what has destroyed the Bengals offense, when in all reality, we haven't seen a good offensive game since the Cleveland win. So you look at the Bills game, and people are going to blame Mike Nugent's 2 missed extra points, but people aren't pointing out the fact that in that game, the Bengals offense punted on every single possession of the entire second half and gained only 23 yards before the Bills started playing to prevent D on the last drive. So, in short, it's not good. The Bengals are lucky enough that they're not in contention at this point, and that it's going to give opportunities to guys like Cody Core, James Wright, Brandon LaFell, and just the rest of and Tyler Boyd, obviously, and the rest of the Bengals receiving players in the passing game, maybe even the tight ends behind Tyler Eifert, CJ Uzomah, Tyler Croft, and obviously Rex Burkhead, now that Giovanni Bernard is out, is going to get some additional looks. And so, it sucks that Green got hurt. If you had to pick a time for Green to get hurt, now is probably not a bad time.
Scott, the Bengals, when the last 2 weeks, I believe they lost by a combined 9 points or something to that effect. And obviously the last 4 weeks have been just crazy. I believe it's been 10 points total. They lost the last 3 games. And then they also tied 4 weeks ago or so against the Redskins there. But looking at these last 2 games, Green essentially missed the entirety of those 2 games. Do you think that his absence would have made a difference in these must-win games for the Bengals to potentially pull out wins?
I'd have to think, it would definitely help, because if you look at the offense, it looks a lot like the playoff game we saw when they played the Colts a couple years ago, and he was out with the concussion. And they just didn't really have anyone to throw to, and they were pulling guys in off the street. And I think that was the game where using Greg Little, and
Right.
I think we had Burkhead playing wide receiver, and you're kind of seeing some of that. I mean, Boyd has had his flashes, but still is a rookie. But as far as rookies go, he's been pretty decent. LaFell's kind of been hit and miss. And it just doesn't look the same. And I think part of that, you kind of see who Dalton is. He's been very fortunate to have one of the best receivers in the NFL his whole career.
Yep.
And, he's gotten a ton of targets. So obviously he's been able to rely on him heavily. And with him out, I think you do see a little difference. And you look at, these games are kind of close. We also had a -2 turnover margin. And the one thing I think Green probably doesn't fix that's been really hurting this team is you look at the rushing yards, we're averaging 75 yards a game and giving up 150. And unless Green can play defense, there's just there's a lot more issues besides Green. He definitely hurts, but I don't know if him alone would have been enough to turn those games around.
Yeah, I mean, initially when I asked you the question, it kind of seems like a duh question. AJ Green, of course he's going to help, but at the same time, and we'll talk about this more later with some of the fan questions and all of that, at the same time, there are so many issues going on with this team, underperformances by guys who are normally the stars of this team, and just issues galore. Yet they've been so close, especially these past 4 weeks, which have been such critical games. They can't pull out a win, and it's been a bit disappointing. One thing that, even though the rush defense has been inconsistent, as Scott mentioned, the overall defense has actually picked it up the last couple of weeks. And you look at the amount of points they gave up, 19 on the road to Baltimore. That's something that a team should easily be able to overcome and potentially win. And they gave up, I believe, 14 or so at home against Buffalo. And the offense really hasn't pulled their weight in terms of converting in the red zone and all of that. Who's kind of stuck out to you? Who's stepped up their games the past couple of weeks, Connor?
Sorry. To me, it has to be Drake Kirkpatrick. I mean, we saw last week against the Ravens, he dropped what could have been a pick six, probably should have been a pick six, but regardless of that missed opportunity, it was a huge play. It really just shows you the development of where he's come, because it was a play where he read, he understood what the Ravens were doing in terms of, where the receiver was going to go, where Flacco was intending on passing, and he made the play. And yeah, again, fault him all you want for the dropped pick, potential pick six, but he made the huge play. And as I've been saying all year, and at first it seemed a little strange to say it out loud, but he's been the best player in the Bengals' entire secondary, and it's not even close at this point. I mean, Drake person who didn't allow a target, he was the only person in the Bengals secondary last week that didn't allow a completion every single time he was targeted. So, and that's not even saying he's playing that well, but it just speaks to what he's been surrounded with, and despite that, he's been playing very well at a position that's very difficult to play, which is the left cornerback position. And so he's playing really well. And then, I mean, obviously you have guys like Vontaze Burfict, who has had he's had 40 tackles, I think, in the past 4 games with a forced fumble and a sack. Not the exact number of tackles is 40, but it's been 10 tackles per game every single week. And he's making plays left and right, despite the fact that people are saying, oh, he's overweight, all this stuff. He hasn't lost a substantial amount of weight, but he's just looking a lot more comfortable now that it seems like he's back into his rhythm, I guess. And so you have Dre, you have Vontaze, and there's playmakers. I mean, Sean Williams and Deron Smith were both hurt last week, yet the Bengals still played a good defensive game with Josh Shaw starting at safety, and Deron Smith didn't play amazing. And the touchdown he gave up to Rashad Perriman was, I mean, it wasn't even really, you can't fault him for that. It was very good coverage, and it was just a good pass by Flacco, which was kind of strange.
And great catch, yeah.
There's been guys who've been stepping up. Clayton Fejedelem, he had 6 snaps, so it's kind of hard to just judge and say, well, he's been great for us. We really haven't seen. That was the first game all year that the Bengals even trusted him to play on defense. But they have talent, and so regardless of however the Bengals are playing this year, it's still an encouraging sign to see whether or not Marvin Lewis stays in Cincinnati. We've seen the defense succeed under Gunther before with the exact same philosophy. So I think it's just a matter of reloading in the draft and maybe even free agency, adding a couple of players on the defensive line and at the linebacker position, hoping that, William Jackson can come back healthy and that Andrew Billings can get back healthy. Marcus Hardison, Brandon Thompson could come back even this year potentially. And so there's a lot of talent, and it's definitely. And I mean, Nick Vigil, obviously, he hasn't been playing great, but he's athletic and he fits what Paul Gunther is trying to do on defense. And so, regardless of whether or not the Bengals change coaches, which I'm sure we're going to talk about ad nauseum, not only this podcast but just throughout the rest of the season, it's encouraging to know that this is still a team with talent, and a lot of that talent is locked up for the long term.
It's a great point, and Vontaze Burfict is a guy who's really picked up his game over the past 3 weeks, I would say, and maybe that's attributed to him getting back into quote-unquote game shape after missing those first 3 games with the suspension there. That's probably part of it, but he's also an emotional leader on this team, and obviously he's carrying some weight. Scott, I want to ask you about one guy. We saw an inconsistent year so far from Carlos Dunlap, but he's another guy who's picked it up. But Geno Atkins has been mysteriously just disappearing over the past couple of weeks. And you mentioned the run issues, and he's a little bit more of a pass rush specialist than he is a run stuffer, but he still is effective in that aspect. Do you think that his up and down play is affecting the entire defense? And if so, what do you think the inconsistency is attributed to?
I'd have to look at the stats as far as his snap counts. I don't have that off the top of my head, but it seems like whenever we see a running play, it's usually, Pat Sims or D'Amato Pecco's in there. And I don't know if he's just getting less snaps this year. If maybe he's not 100%, if there's something nagging that we don't know about. But when he is in there, it does seem like he's usually getting a good push. He's just not getting to the quarterback like he has been. And I don't know if it's just because the other guys like Johnson and Pecco aren't helping pull blockers away. Because I know he's good. Obviously, Atkins is great at splitting double teams, but when you put him one-on-one, that seems to be where he really dominates. And if teams are able to not use a double team on, or not, use a double team on the air guys, so they can focus on Atkins, that might be taking it away. But because he definitely has the flashes, but he just hasn't had those plays where you're like, wow, did you just see him dominate that guy? And I don't know if he's just not getting enough of the one-on-one, but it's definitely disturbing because he's the jersey I most often wear, so I'd like to see him do well. Now, I'd rather have his jersey than Brandon Tate, so it's not like, of course he's gone, but so at least it's someone who is still pretty good. But yeah, he definitely seems, and it's hard to say he's down because if you look at the replays, like it looks like he's getting, he's getting pushed, he's getting active. It's not like he's just disappeared, but the numbers just don't seem to be there, and he's not as consistent at the quarterback. And I have to wonder, is it, and it's hard to know without being in the locker room. Is it scheme? Is it because he doesn't have the guys around him? And it makes you kind of wonder, well, if Andrew Billings wasn't hurt, would he have the year a lot of us kind of hoped he would have, which of course, how much can you actually trust a rookie to be as good as you want him to be? The guy that falls in the 3rd, 4th round, that, he's going to be this phenomenal player. But if Billings was in there and if he was as good as we hoped or half as good as we hoped, would that be pulling an extra blocker away where Atkins would get more one-on-one with a center or guard and look like the guy we see who just knocks people over and gets the quarterback?
Yeah.
I think part of it has to be Dunlap as a streaky player as well. I mean, I don't know if we're talking Dunlap or Atkins here, but last year Dunlap had 13 and a half sacks, and he only had a sack in 9 of 16 games. So, I mean, that's half the season where he didn't have a sack. And this year, Dunlap and Atkins have combined for 11 sacks. And I think one thing that I've noticed that I'm pretty sure a lot of people have also noticed is that the Bengals on occasion will get that pressure and they'll be able to get to the quarterback. But quarterbacks, for whatever reason, have had such an easy time getting out of the pocket, rolling right, and either running for a first down, throwing a pass away, or completing a pass downfield. I think it's just a matter of, I wouldn't say scheme as much as it is execution, which I've been saying all year with almost everything, but you really see it in plays like these where, Atkins, Dunlap, advanced metrics still love both of them, but they're not putting up numbers. And the reason why is just because it's just little things like the angles they take, overstretching, like they'll beat their guy, but they go too far outside or they cut too far inside, and the quarterback is able to maneuver his way out of the situation. And I think that it's just something where the defense has to start adapting, and I think Paul Gunther has tried to do that in a little ways. I've seen Michael Johnson line up at left defensive end a couple of times, which was an interesting move, but I'm not really sure why that happened. But it shows that he's at least trying to change things, and people are going to criticize him for the plays where Johnson and Dunlap drop into coverage, but we saw either this week or last week there was a play where Michael Johnson made a huge tackle to prevent a third down conversion, which ultimately forced the opponent to punt. And so I think that Gunther is doing a good job. He's getting a lot of criticism, which I don't really think is warranted. But ultimately, what it comes down to is just when you have a team or a defense that has two guys who you would argue are elite players, like potentially top 5 of their position, you need those guys to put up numbers. You need the sacks that are changing the game. That's ultimately what it comes down to, because I mean, you can't be counting on your secondary players on the defense to be making those plays. You need your top tier guys to have that money to do.
Yeah, good assessment by both of you guys. I mean, Geno Atkins, I believe, was left off the stat sheet entirely last week against Baltimore. Not even a tackle. I mean, probably pressures and things of that nature. I don't have that in front of me, but in terms of tackle, sacks, things like that, he was not on the stat sheet from what I saw. And it's been a little bit more of a quiet year from Geno Atkins than we're used to. But the defense has played well in the last 2 losses that the Bengals have suffered against the Bills and the Ravens in week 11 and week 12. What are your thoughts on the Bengals, either the current state of the team, what you saw in the last 2 games? You can get in touch with us in a variety of different ways. We are live every week on YouTube, so you can check us out. There's a chat portion in there, so leave us a question. We've been taking fan questions weekly, basically, since the show's inception. So please join us Wednesday nights when we have that up there. You can also subscribe to the YouTube channel. You can subscribe to our SoundCloud channel. You can get in touch with us on Twitter at BengalsOBI. Shoot us an email, theobinsider@gmail.com. Or you can check us out on Cincy Jungle, the SB Nation site. We stream this show through that platform. And you can download us on iTunes. So we're in a lot of different places. Check us out, and we appreciate the support that you guys have shown us. Even through this rough Bengals season, we appreciate the support you've shown us in our inaugural year of this show. Switching gears here a little bit, and this this might be a little bit of an easy topic because there seem to be so many issues with the Bengals in 2016. It's been a frustrating year because you see talented players, you see the core that this team is locked up, yet I think I mentioned at either the onset of the show or just before, the Bengals in their last 4 games, I think they lost the 3 games by a combined 10 points or something like that. And then they tied the game against the Redskins, and they're just on the cusp, but they can't finish. They shoot themselves in the foot, and a lot of underachievement is happening with this team. So, Scott, I will start with you, and I'm going to ask this question. What do you think is the biggest issue plaguing the team this year to get them to 3-7-1?
Well, the easy answer would be just to say the team. Short of that, if I have to go specific, I mean, there are so many ways you can go with this. You can say, obviously Nugent's been horrible, but that's just Nugent being Nugent. The offensive line has obviously had some issues. He's struggled to replace Andre Smith. Bodine's been Bodine, and we've obviously hit that pretty hard ever since we've been doing this podcast. The secondary, Dre's been good. As Connor said, other than that, the secondary just hasn't been like they were last year with things like getting the turnovers, the interceptions. And I've done a post before, and we've talked about the huge coaching turnover they've had the last couple of years and just losing a lot of talent coaching these guys. But if I was to pick one thing to say this is what if I could pin it all on one thing, the biggest problem, I'd say for me, it's the failures in the draft the last few years. Because this is a team that, if you look at a boxer, they generally box with 2 hands, obviously, because they have 2 hands, unless you're that guy for Mortal Kombat who has the 4 hands. Not, assuming, I don't know his name, but assuming he's not in the picture, it's, and the Bengals are really good about tying one hand behind their back. And they just want to box that one hand, which is fine, but you have to have a pretty strong right hand if you want to do that. And so what they do is you build through draft and free agency. They tend to ignore free agency altogether as far as the higher pick or the higher price guys, the guys that go in the first week or so, and they kind of look for the bargains, the guys that aren't going to cost them compensation picks, the guys that you can get pretty cheap after that initial period. So if you're going to build only through the draft, you've really got to nail the draft. And they did a really good job back in 2010 or 10 and 11 when they got Dunlap, they got Geno Atkins, they got Green and Dalton, also got Bodine in there. And then the next year they managed to get Aloka and Jones kind of late. So you kind of have that core, and that's pretty much been the core of this team. And then, of course, they got Burfict, but he wasn't drafted. So, but since then, and they got a lot of great publicity, like, wow, this team is good at drafting. They know what they're doing. You know, they signed their own. They got these good guys. But you look at since then, their top few picks, you go to 2013, Eifert was good. Obviously, that was a good pick. Giovanni Bernard, he's been good. You could argue that, okay, Le'Veon Bell was taken later, but still, Bernard was a good pick for what they wanted. After that, Hunt has obviously had issues. He's had struggles even getting on the field as a backup. Sean Williams, the next pick, seems to be a liability in coverage. Definitely not starter material, not comparable to what I think we had in Reggie Nelson. The next year, Darqueze Dennard barely played the first year, played sparingly his next year, then got hurt. This year seems to struggle. Whenever you see him give up a touchdown, it seems more often than not he's in coverage or on the field, which is kind of disturbing for a guy who is supposed to be pretty highly regarded in his third season. Jeremy Hill has struggled mightily since that breakout campaign his rookie year. Will Clark, same as Marcus Hunt, hasn't gotten on the field. Russell Bodine, we could spend we have spent a lot of time discussing his issues. And then 2015, Obuehi has struggled mightily playing the right defensive end, and where we bring in this old journeyman has kind of been passed around. Eric Winston, who's beaten him. Jake Fisher can't even seem to get on the field with the offensive line problems. Tyler Croft, same issue. They don't seem to like him enough to put him on the field. And PJ Dawson, who they seem to hate. So there's really no one from 2015, the first four picks, that they even seem to want to play. And then this year, William Jackson gets hurt. Andrew Billings gets hurt. Nick Vigil, they don't want to play because he's a rookie, apparently, even though linebackers could definitely be improved.
He's been playing
Tyler
now.
Boyd's been decent. So for me, that's the one thing. I'm going to say it's the draft picks, because when you, like I said, if you want to box with one arm tied behind your back, you have to have a good, strong arm, and they just have not been doing it. And all the praise we've kind of given them for, Tobin and player personnel, for Dalton, it just doesn't seem to be panning out over the last 4 years. And so I would say that's the biggest, the biggest problem. It's basically caught up with them.
It's a great point. And, you look at their drafts, there's two things that stick out to me with that, Scott, and that's, a great point. Number one, they kept touting this best player available type of strategy. And what they do is they wait for a guy that maybe it's not a position of need, but it falls to them, and they try and draft and develop that player. And hasn't always worked. And now you see these myriad of first-round corners, and they're sitting on the bench or injured or waiting behind other guys, and it's just hasn't played out. And the most ironic thing, you mentioned Burfict, Scott. The ironic thing there, he's the best linebacker that Lewis has had with the Bengals, and he's an undrafted player. They've spent a bunch of money in free agency on linebackers. They've tried to draft other mid-round guys, and they haven't worked out yet. Burfict, the undrafted guy, is the best in 14 years that the Bengals have had.
Well, it seems like their best players tend to be players who, for whatever reason, fall to them, that are just really highly regarded, such as Dunlap. He was considered a first-round pick, and he had some character red flags. He fell. Same with Burfict. He had some red flags that fell. They just haven't seemed to have as many of those the past few years. Some people argued that Obuehi was a reach. Tyler Croft seemed like a huge reach. Nick Vigil, when he was drafted, obviously we haven't seen if he can play. Yeah, Clark was one. Trading up for Bodine was one.
Yep.
So they seem to have gone from, and even George Aloka was a huge steal. A lot of people considered him one of the top few safeties that year. So they have gone from this team who just sat. They got these amazing people that fell to them, and it's like, wow, this is incredible. And then they more often than not panned out, to now where they get the guys either right where they should have gone or a little higher. And it's okay if you want to do best player available, but you've got to get the best player. You can't say best player available and get the seventh best player. It just doesn't
Yeah.
Seem to pan out. And for whatever reason, the draft gold they had 5-6 years ago just doesn't seem to be materializing this year.
Yeah, and the draft draft and develop philosophy only really works if those guys in those mid rounds, late rounds end up being solid picks, as some of these other guys end up leaving in free agency or what have you. And by the way, Scott, the four-armed character from Mortal Kombat, his name is Goro. Okay, Goro. Check it out. Connor, what do you think is the biggest issue that's facing this team this year?
I mean, it has to be line play. I mean, there's not even really much use talking about it. The offensive line was a top
right?
5 unit last year. Well, both sides. I mean, the offensive line is a top 5 unit this year. Has been one of the league's worst this year. Probably not the worst, but one of the worst. And then you have the D line, who last year Geno Atkins and Carlos Dunlap alone put up double-digit sacks. Michael Johnson and Domata Peko weren't. They were playing pretty well. Domata Peko had 5 sacks, I think, last year. And Johnson was still a great run defender, and he's still a good run defender, but we all know what his limitations are. And even though they didn't have the rotation like they still don't this year, Wallace Gilbert really wasn't playing that well, and they brought him back, and he's still been the same player. Margus Hunt has probably been a little bit of an upgrade, but not by very much, if any. And, Geno Atkins and Carlos Dunlap aren't putting up numbers, and now all of a sudden only 4 teams, I think, have fewer sacks than the Bengals, and only one team has fewer forced fumbles than the Bengals 5, which happens to be the Titans, who, I don't know why no one is talking about this. The Titans have not forced a single fumble all season. I think that's insane. But, the Bengals haven't gotten any sacks, and as a result, I think, haven't been getting any forced fumbles, which is huge. And obviously, pressures are great, but sacks are better, and they change the dynamic of a game. They put the quarterback on his toes, and they can potentially result in forced fumbles, which is your best chance of getting a forced fumble is on a strip sack of any type of, especially with a guy like Dunlap, who his club is so good at, and Geno Atkins too. Geno Atkins is really good at forcing fumbles off sacks, and so you're not getting as many sacks, you're not getting as many turnovers. The defensive line has high expectations, and they're not playing well either.
I agree, and the strip sack thing, we saw that this last week. Andy Dalton fumbled the ball 4 times, 3 of which I believe were on sacks.
That's huge, and the Ravens barely beat the Bengals in that game, despite the fact that they strip sacked him 4 times.
Yep, he lost 2 of them. One of which was an errant of the 4. One of which was an errant snap by Russell Bodine that hit off of his chest, and he ended up losing that football when the Bengals were in scoring position, I believe, at that point. And then he had 4 on the day, that's not a recipe to win for me. And good stuff from you too, Connor. It might be an obvious answer, but it definitely is a good one for me. I do agree with both of you, but I look at one physical aspect of the club, and maybe it's because I've got a little bit more of a baseball background than a football background, but I look at also a mental aspect. The physical aspect for me, I look at overall team speed. And the Bengals had a chance, Scott mentioned the draft issues. They had a chance to package some picks and maybe get up and get a speedy receiver. There were some other speedy options in free agency. Travis Benjamin is one. Mike Wallace, who made some good plays against the Bengals last week, is another to be a complimentary speed receiver opposite A.J. Green. Now that Green's going down, you see the secondary giving no respect to what's out on the field. Even though some guys are still making some plays, they're still not giving any respect to the deep ball and loading up the box against the run, and that's not good. Scott mentioned the issues in the Bengals' run offense as well. So not only that, linebacker team speed is another issue for me. Maybe getting a speed rusher off the edge, an edge guy, kind of a tweener linebacker. This team needs to get faster. The big guys, the strong guys, those are always good guys to have. But you look at this team, and there's not really much sizzle in terms of team speed. They lost Andrew Hawkins a couple of years ago. They lost Marvin Jones this year. There's not a speedy linebacker, really. Vigil is one, but he's not really getting much time. So I see team speed as a major issue. And the other, I just think this team, I've said it before on this show, I think this team is experiencing a massive hangover from the wild card game. And I think that trickles down from coaching. I think that trickles down from just being shell-shocked of how last season ended and really getting sick of the same type of one-and-done exits out of the postseason. And I think that's really taken a toll on this team. And, you've got some aging veterans that doesn't help, but some guys who have been here for a long time and who have seen it all through this team. And really last year was inexplicable what happened against the Steelers. And I think that has stuck with them, even with all the rhetoric they gave us this offseason. I think that has stuck with them 100% through this year, and they haven't gotten over it. And we can talk about those issues as to why that is. We've got some fan questions later in the show we're going to address as to why that may be. But that to me, I think the one physical aspect and one mental aspect for me are kind of the things that are really sticking out this year for the Bengals to go 3-7-1 and really looking to 2017 at this point. What are your thoughts, listeners? If you want, I mentioned the ways you can get in touch with us via YouTube channel, SoundCloud channel, on Twitter at BengalsOBI, via email, theobinsider@gmail.com, or a variety of different ways. You can leave a comment for us on iTunes as well. Get in touch with us. Let us know what you think the biggest issue is with the Cincinnati Bengals. Do you disagree with us? Do you agree with us? Let us know. We want to hear from you. Let's move on, though, to, now that we've discussed the myriad of issues with the Bengals, let's move on to their next test. They host the Philadelphia Eagles, who started off really hot and now have really fallen off the map and showing their youth and inexperience both in the head coaching rank and at quarterback. Connor, you coined this in a very clever fashion, the Battle of the Gingers. And obviously you're talking about Andy Dalton and Carson Wentz. Obviously that's something that the quarterback play is going to be paramount, but what are you looking at this week and for the Bengals to potentially right the ship?
Yeah, otherwise known as the Sunscreen Bowl. And I think when you look at the Eagles, who, despite what they did early in the year, are a very beatable team. I mean, you have Darren Sproles and Wendell Smallwood are both small running backs who have been fairly effective, but not, very extraordinary as runners. Ryan Matthews is coming off injury. He might play, he might not, but he'll be limited probably if he does play. You have a team which has pretty much no weapons at the receiving position with, I don't even know who their best pass catcher is. Jordan Matthews has been dinged up, and he hasn't been great. Zach Ertz I haven't heard his name spoken all season after he signed a pretty decent contract in the past offseason. And their offensive line, to my knowledge, hasn't been amazing either. And so it's really an opportunity for the Bengals defense to continue and capitalize and make some plays against the Eagles offense. And you look at the Eagles defense, and they have some good players, Fletcher Cox, Brandon Graham. Both of those guys are playing really, really well in the pass rush. And they have a couple other guys. I know Benny Logan had a good year last year. Ronnie McLeod and Malcolm Jenkins are one of the best safety duos in the NFL. But Bengals offense still has an opportunity to go out and prove that they can gain some yardage without AJ Green. I know the Eagles aren't a terrific run-stuffing defense, and obviously Jim Schwartz has been a great defensive coordinator for them, and they've been playing well. But, the Bengals have every opportunity to win this game. It's really a pretty evenly matched game when you think about it, and they're playing in Cincinnati. The Eagles are one of three, I believe, teams that have never beaten the Bengals in Cincinnati, along with the Giants and one other team, which I don't remember, but yeah, it's a winnable game, and I know that there's fans out there rooting for the team to tank. I don't know how you guys feel about it. Personally, I just want to see the team play well and win because they're going to get a good pick regardless. I don't think the difference between a number 7 pick and a number 10 pick is really going to be that big of a difference in hindsight, and obviously we'll probably talk about it as if, the number 7 pick goes and becomes a perennial All-Pro, but ultimately the Bengals are going to have a good draft pick this year regardless of how they finish. Might as well watch them win some games and give the players some confidence. And if who knows, maybe a free agent sees the Bengals playing hard at the end of the season and wants to join Cincinnati. So, I guess that's all I have on that.
Yeah, well, I agree with you on one point, but On the other hand,
I can see why people would want.
Well, I'm not saying tank. I'm not saying tank, but we've seen this team under Marvin Lewis have a late season surge, and all of a sudden that's the excuse to keep the coach even longer. And
for what it's worth, I don't think he's going to get fired. I think the only way he's not the coach next year is if he resigns or moves into the front office, which is possible. But I mean, the Bengals have, we can talk about it later on that point.
Yeah, we've got some fan questions, a lot of questions on Marvin Lewis coming up here in the next segment. But Scott, you had some thoughts on this matchup as well. I don't know if it's necessarily the quarterback play between Dalton and Wentz. I did see something interesting on Monday Night Football when the Eagles were playing the Packers, and Carson Wentz was impeccable when he had a clean pocket, but when he had to run out of the pocket, he had a terrible quarterback rating. And now we're talking about inconsistent pressure from the Bengals defensive line there, and that could be an issue. But your thoughts on this game?
Yeah, I think it's interesting you mentioned Wentz because when they back in the draft, before the draft, when they traded, I think they gave a first, a third, a fourth, a first, and a second, so 5 picks for Carson Wentz in the 4th rounder, and that was for the number 2 pick. Not even really knowing who was going number 1 because the Rams were kind of, we like this guy, we like that guy. So you're giving up a ton for a guy who you don't even know who you're getting yet. And then the first 4 games, Wentz comes out, and everyone's like, oh my goodness, like they really got this right. First 4 games, he averaged over 250 yards, 7 touchdowns, only 1 pick, passer rating over 100. Eagles were 3-1, and it just looked like the Eagles nailed it. Well, since then, people seem to have figured him out a little bit. His passing numbers is down to about 225 yards a game. I think he has 4 touchdowns to 7 interceptions. Passer ratings like 73, so still better than Manziel when he was in Cleveland, but getting near that level. And his team's 2-5. And I think it's multiple things. One, you look at the first 4 games they played. They had teams like Chicago and Cleveland and Detroit, and teams that are generally beatable. Since then, they've had a much tougher schedule, and I think teams have kind of figured him out a little bit where he's been getting sacked a lot more and just getting a lot more pressure. And like you said with the Monday night game, that seems to be the key with him, is that if you can get some pressure on him, especially now in his rookie year. Now, maybe in 3-4 years, he could be a really good quarterback in the pocket and with pressure. But right now in his first year, and we're kind of seeing, that transition from North Dakota up to, the NFL, that, there's definitely some things he needs to learn, growing pains that a lot of quarterbacks have their first year. So I think that's the key is, can we, the guys we mentioned, can Geno Atkins, can Dunlap, can they get the quarterback, and can the rest of the defensive line do enough to help those guys get to the quarterback? Or can they pick up, the mess if those guys are getting double teams and flushing him? Can their guys like Johnson or Gilberry or whoever's in there, can they get the sack when he's chasing them? And so I think that's, for me, one of the key things to see is, what is going to happen with that. The other thing I want to see is, what is our offense going to do? We've mentioned it's just been dreadful the last few weeks, AJ Green or not. They've just really struggled to run the ball. Dalton missed a couple open guys in the end zone last week that ended up missing out on a touchdown. I think it was maybe LaFell and Eifert on back-to-back passes that cost him a chance at a touchdown. And so what are we going to do in that situation? And as Connor mentioned, Jim Schwartz has really turned that defense around. Right now their NFL rank is the best it's been since like 2008 when they had a guy named McNabb quarterbacking them. So it's been a while since their defense has been that good. So I guess those are the things I want to see, especially the Wentz thing, because he's struggling, but we're struggling to get pressure. And the Bengals historically just really struggle against rookie quarterbacks. And you go back to Trevor Siemian to see that's still the case.
Yeah, and I'm going to agree with you and kind of piggyback off of you, Scott, for what I'm looking at. And that is, I go back to what I was saying in the last segment about what's wrong with the Bengals, and that's team speed. And you're right about the Bengals struggling against rookie quarterbacks. They seem to not really do their due diligence, whether it's the film room or whatever. They don't seem to really have an answer for a lot of rookie and or first-time starting quarterbacks. Like you mentioned, Siemian was one this year. But I note the team speed or lack thereof in the Bengals defensive front seven and Wentz, even though he struggles throwing the ball under pressure when he has to roll out. He's an athletic guy who can scramble and get yards with his legs. And that's another type of quarterback the Bengals have struggled with over the years are those scrambling quarterbacks. And I'm really interested to see if the Bengals can, on the defensive front, keep Wentz not only in the pocket, but maybe pressure him. And if they flush him out of the pocket, if they're able to chase him down and get negative plays or force a turnover from him to get the win there. So I'm in agreement with both of you. Since our last segment, the fan question segment, might be a tad long. We normally end with score predictions, but I think since we're talking about the quote-unquote battle of the gingers now, I'm going to ask for your score predictions now, gentlemen. Connor, do you have a score prediction for this game?
I believe I sent it to someone. Hit Scott first.
Okay. Scott?
Okay, I'm going to give a slight explanation for this. The Eagles are pretty good at stopping rushing touchdowns, not so good about passing touchdowns. So I'm going to assume Dalton has some accuracy in the red zone this week. So I'm going to give him a couple passing touchdowns. So I'm going to say Eifert, he's going to do, and then either Boyd or LaFell. So I'm going to say we get 2 touchdowns. They do a decent job running the ball. I think they're in the top half of the league, and we kind of struggle with that. So I'm going to give them a rushing touchdown, as we kind of mentioned. We struggle against rookie quarterbacks. So let's say Wentz gets a passing touchdown, and we're just going to give them up to these crazy people. So I'm going to say Doral Green Beckham gets the passing touchdown. So for whatever. So 2 touchdowns each. I want us to win, so I'll give us a field goal. We're obviously going to miss the extra points. So
of course.
I'm going to say 15-14 Bengals.
What was it?
I said
15-14 Bengals.
Okay.
And I said 17-14 on the record, so I guess I'm going with that. I feel like I say that every single week, but whatever.
So you're giving Nugent the benefit of the doubt on this extra points.
I think the PAT. I think what will happen is, and this isn't part of my prediction, but a little side prediction here. But I think the best chance of him making a PAT is a little false start. Maybe get a Wakey to move a little bit, move that back, give him a little more comfort, and I think he'll have a better chance of putting that right through the uprights.
So I've been picking against the Bengals the past couple of weeks, whether it's on this show or through the Cincy Jungle weekly pick'em thing that Connor puts up there. So I think they get off the schneid this week, and I don't think it'll be easy. I'll just say 20-17. I think it'll be really close, and I think finally the Bengals get a lucky bounce and or get the kicks from their kicker or something that hasn't been going right for them this year finally starts to bounce their way, and I think they get a win this week, especially because it's at home. But then again, the Boo Birds tend to come out at home, and that doesn't help the home team either. But I'm still going to say 20-17 Bengals and stick with that. So those are our score predictions. Now it is time for fan questions, and this week there's a couple that we've got, and they all kind of revolve around the same topic, and it's been through Twitter, it's been through email. So I'm going to read an email first, and then I'm going to read a tweet, and then I'll kind of, there's so many different aspects to this topic. We'll try and sift through it and get some true questions out of it. This is more of a statement email from a listener called Alan Suiters, and it said the topic was in all caps, and it said Marvin Lewis, and it said, I became a Bengal fan when Boomer Esiason was quarterback and Sam Wyche was head coach. I stuck with them for so many years, but have given up on them because it seems that as long as fans are filling the seats, then Mike Brown is content. Marvin Lewis was an awesome defensive coordinator, but every good assistant coach will not always be a good head coach. Marvin Lewis is way overrated as a head coach. He is mediocre at best, as his very talented but undisciplined team that he has year after year struggles with opponents with record over 500. Coaching change is about 6 years overdue. So that's an email from Alan Suiters. We also got a tweet here from Jesse Bickers. Basically, we said, do you have any questions? And he said, again, a statement, lack of leadership and coaching. There are problems within the team itself, but those can be easily fixed, obviously pointing to coaching. So, Connor, let's start with you, and I'll circle back with you in a minute also on another topic. But you tend to think a bit higher, especially now, of Marvin Lewis than maybe a good portion of the fan base.
Yeah, definitely.
Do you want to touch on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, and I don't think I'm alone in this. I think most of the people in the actual, like I say actual because we're, still a fan site, but the actual like Cincinnati media, Dave Lapham, those kind of guys, they all really still embrace Marvin Lewis as a coach. And personally, you look at Marvin. I mean, I look at Marvin Lewis and I see a coach who, yeah, his primetime record isn't great, and all these things that you can indict him for. At the end of the day, he's still had a winning record with, the Bengals went 9-7 with a rookie quarterback and a rookie receiver leading the team. They had a not very talented team in Dalton's first 2 years and still managed to make the playoffs. 2013 comes around, that brutal Chargers loss happens in the playoffs. And what goes on stated in most of these games is that I'm not trying to make excuses, but we really still haven't seen Marvin Lewis put in a chance to really like win a playoff. I mean, 2013, Geno Atkins was hurt in the playoffs, and you saw the Chargers run all over the Bengals, and you just you can't help but wonder what would it have been like if they had Geno Atkins. And 2014 rolls around, the entire roster is hurt. 2015 rolls around, Andy Dalton's hurt, and I'm not trying to just make excuses. Obviously, you still have to win those games. That's your job as a coach, and there have been a lot of Super Bowl champions that have had rosters that didn't have some of their best players. That being said, most of the recent Super Bowl champions have all been very healthy teams who haven't been losing any of their top players. But Lewis is a guy I still think people are saying he's a below average coach, which I just can't agree with. I mean, I think that if he were to be available, that half the league would want him immediately. And so, I mean, I guess that's just kind of where I stand on it.
It's an interesting stance, especially, and I was talking with someone this week about, if Lewis has truly had a fair shake in the playoffs because of the injuries. I don't know. Scott, I don't know if you want to maybe coattail off of that or talk about, those injuries in the postseason, maybe Lewis's primetime struggles. Do you think that he just your overall thoughts, I guess, to start off this conversation?
Well, I think this is an interesting question because I actually have a post coming out. I think sometime in the next few days about Lewis and why I think the Bengals are not going to fire him or get rid of him. Which is kind of interesting because a lot of the national media are saying, "Oh, it's time for him to go. It's time for him to go. They're going to get rid of him. He's on the hot seat."
He's not on the hot seat. Like that I think anyone who knows the team knows he's not on the hot seat.
Yeah, I think that's just national media speculation because, hey, he has a losing record. Obviously, he's on the hot seat. No, that's not the Bengals. And I think you kind of have to look at the history of Mike Brown. And going back to his first year as owner, he never really got along with Sam Weish. That first season, Sam Weish had a bad year. They went 3-13. They kind of had a falling out, pointed fingers at each other. End of the day, Weish was gone. Brown said Weish resigned. Weish said he fired him. Whatever happened, he got rid of him. He brought in, the hot, trendy young Shula. Shula was horrible, stuck with him way too long, probably because they didn't want to go through another Weish thing. And then another bad coach. They just could not seem to get a good coach who could get that team to win. He brings in Marvin Lewis, and immediately they go from a 3-4 win team to a team that each year wins 7, 8, 9 games. Kind of erases that horrible decade in the 90s. And I think at that point, Mike Brown was like, this is my guy. I don't want to go back to this horrible thing that happened after I got rid of the good coach my dad brought in. I got rid of this guy. We kind of had a falling out. Things went to hell for over a decade. I finally got someone in here who seems to know what he's doing. I'm just sticking with him forever. And if people want to say, yeah, they need to get rid of him or whatever, just look back to 2008. In 2005, they won the playoffs, or went to the playoffs. 2006, they had a down year. 2007 had a worse year. 2008 had a horrible year. So if you're going to get rid of him, most teams, that's what you get rid of him. No, they kept him. And then a few years later, they had another bad year in 2010. They kept him. They're off of 5 straight, playoff appearances. Yeah, they're having a crappy year right now, but I just don't see Mike Brown getting rid of him. If he didn't get rid of him in 2008 or 2010, he's not getting rid of him now.
it's a gamble at the end of the day. It's a move where you know what you have with Lewis, and we've seen another good point I heard today on Cincinnati radio. I believe it was Fox with Lapham, was that they were talking about the Bengals and the AFC North in general, and how every team in the AFC North has had a down year. The Ravens last year were a really bad team. And obviously they had injuries, but fans probably aren't just saying, Harbaugh should stick around. People want their coach fired whenever things don't go right. And, give him credit. The Ravens turned around. The Steelers wanted, they are eternally asking for Bill Cowher to return as the head coach. Bill Cowher was, I believe that's his name, right? Bill Cowher. My brain is mush right now. But before he won the Super Bowl, the Steelers had a really bad year, and fans were hoping that he would get axed. And that's not to say that Lewis is just going to suddenly turn this team around, but it's a gamble. Especially with the market right now, your best options are either guys who are first-year would be first-year head coaches, or 10-year veterans coaches who don't really have that Super Bowl caliber pedigree. And you look at, if you're Mike Brown, you look at Lewis and you see a guy who has consistently won games for you. And granted, he still hasn't won that elusive big game, but you know what you have with him. And I think if you're Brown, you think as long as you have a chance to get to the playoffs, which I think he thinks that the Bengals will have with Lewis next year, he's like Scott kind of said, it's loyalty, perhaps to a fault, but you know what you get with him, and that's a lot easier to deal with than a young regardless of how you feel about these coaches that are young and potentially are going to be able to change. And that's why I say with Lewis, I don't hope he gets fired. I hope that for his own career and for the Bengals' sake, I hope that he finds a new home. And I think Lewis in Jacksonville fit for a coach who transformed a defense and helped a young team accomplish a lot. I think that'd be awesome for him. Or even to just move into the front office. I think there's a lot of stuff like that. Just reasons that Lewis retiring could be an actually legitimate option, and add that to the fact that they had that succession plan with Hugh Jackson. It's definitely something that he's going to consider. He's a person after all. He's going to go to bed one night and think about, well, is this right for me? Is this right for the Bengals? He has the team's best interest in mind just as well as he has his own. So it'll be interesting to watch, but from Brown's perspective, I think you have to understand why he feels that way. I think too many fans are just saying, "Oh, Mike Brown ownership." There isn't a single fan base that loves its owner at the end of the day, except the Packers, because their owners are their fans.
Or the Patriots. I think the Patriots are pretty happy with their owner, but
Bob Kraft, yeah, but even still, I think a lot of fans probably aren't. Granted, yeah, they like him a lot more than most fans like their owners, but there's still even some probably that aren't huge fans.
To Scott's point, one of the reasons, aside from the more successful campaigns that Lewis has had compared to his predecessors with Mike Brown, is they have a great working relationship, and I think that plays a major factor into why Lewis has hung on so long. And if you read certain things from Jeff Hobson, who is the Bengals.com editor and has a good pulse on the team, he always notes that Mike Brown has also looked at the Steelers and noted the continuity of head coaches there. And even when they've had those disappointing 7-9, 8-8 seasons, they've still stuck with their coaches through some of those seasons. And they obviously have been successful. But I would like to say I think Lewis is gone after this year. Again, depending on how this record ends up and how the team ends up playing the rest of the season. But Lewis is under contract through 2017. My guess is that probably after that contract's up, they will let Lewis walk away after 2017 and not really do the firing thing. I think Brown trusts Lewis. I think they have a good working relationship, as I said, and I think he wants him to stick around. But personally speaking, I think it's time. I think we know what we have with Marvin Lewis, and yes, there's a risk, but this team has now gotten into this almost complacently comfortable culture going in within it, where Not a lot of change, not a lot of free agency. Let's not rock the boat too much. Let's not change head coaches. And you're seeing similar or worse finishes year after year under Marvin Lewis, and he's done some great things. I think he's a good coach, and like the emailer said, I think he's a good coach. I don't think he's a great coach. I think he's probably akin to Marty Schottenheimer in the way that he can rebuild a terrible team and make it competitive, but can't win those big games, and that needs to change. And I think that a head coaching change would help that. Before we get out of here, one more little topic with these fan questions on Marvin Lewis, and again, we appreciate those coming our way. Connor, you put up a post about some possible head coaching candidates. Quickly, who are maybe a couple on the top of your wish list if the Bengals were to make a coaching change that are realistic, obviously?
Yeah. So I think the top guy has to be Kyle Shanahan, who's currently the Falcons' offensive coordinator. And before fans go and cite the whole, oh, Dave Shula didn't work, why would another son of an NFL head coach work? Dave Shula was a guy who became a head coach 10 years after he started coaching, which is very, very early to just start head coaching. Kyle Shanahan, on the other hand, he's 36 years old, and this is his 8th year as an offensive coordinator, let alone a coach in the NFL. He's been coaching in the NFL for even longer than that. So, yeah, he's young, but he's the brightest. Well, I don't want to say brightest. He's the most innovative mind in the entire NFL. The Falcons' offense has completely transformed with him. The running game has been incredible. The passing game has been even better. And the blocking scheme, people are going to credit Alex Mack for the Falcons blocking. Well, what has happened is Kyle Shanahan has completely changed the Falcons scheme. They're doing a lot of different things with their zone blocking concepts, and they've turned guys like 2013 undrafted free agent right tackle Ryan Schrader into a guy who just got a huge extension. I mean, it's not just Alex Mack. It's not. You can't just say that an offensive line is playing well because of one player. That's a little bit ignorant of a statement to make. The entire Falcons offense has been great with Shanahan, and as we've seen with him before, he was a guy who spent a year in Cleveland. He's a guy who stands up for what he believes in the sense of he doesn't just want his bosses to tell him what to do. We saw him leave Cleveland because of the fact that the Browns ownership wanted him to start Johnny Manziel, and Shanahan did not want to start Manziel. Rather, he wanted to, make it. I don't remember. I think it might have been McCown who he wanted to start at quarterback, who ultimately ended up being the better player in that situation. So Shanahan has the pedigree as a young coach, and the offensive, he's gonna bring change, and that's something you want to see. But he's also the least risky, young, inexperienced, quote unquote. But he's a young guy who who has no NFL head coaching experience, but in the same sense wouldn't be a major gamble. I think another two guys who would make sense would be Panthers defensive coordinator Sean McDermott and Lions defensive coordinator Terrell Austin. Both run really similar schemes to Cincinnati with that too high safety coverage, running a lot of cover 2 and cover 4 concepts. And both of those guys have turned, kind of like Mike Zimmer and Paul Gunther. They've had those defenses that don't necessarily have the star power in the personnel, but have managed to turn those defenses into some of the NFL's best. We saw the Panthers last year; their front seven was unbelievable, and even without Josh Norman in the years preceding that and the year following that, they've Sean McDermott's secondary has been overachieving to the point where veteran guys who've just been cast-offs like Kurt Coleman have been outstanding playmakers. And then Terrell Austin in Detroit has developed or has helped the Lions, despite losing Ndamukong Suh and Nick Fairley, turn into one of the best defenses in the NFL. And we see even this year Ziggy Ansah, who was, I think he had double-digit sacks last year. I think he had the same amount as Carlos Dunlap with 13.5. He had 0 sacks this year, but despite that, another defensive end, I forget his name, has 7 or 8 sacks of his own. And Detroit's defense has really been stepping up despite, the huge Suh loss was something that was something that you wouldn't think the team would just be able to quickly turn around from. And then a couple other guys, offensive minds, Mike Shula, another guy, brother of Dave Shula, who obviously fans are going to criticize for, but he's been a coach since 1988, and he's worked his way up. He became an offensive coordinator for the first time in '96. was the head coach of Alabama for 3 years, had a up and down stint there. He's been the offensive coordinator for Carolina since 2013, and obviously he's best known for helping the Panthers, despite losing Kelvin Benjamin before the season even started, become a Super Bowl offense, and that was huge. Harold Goodwin of the Cardinals helped transform Bruce Arians' team from they had the Kevin Kolb days where they were one of the worst offenses in the NFL. And this year has been a little bit of a down year, but we saw last year the Cardinals were a huge team. The offense was amazing. Carson Palmer had a career renaissance. David Johnson has been great. Chris Johnson was a completely different player last year than he was in any year previous after his 2,000-yard seasons. And then the last guy I'll mention is Anthony Lynn, Bills' offensive coordinator now, who started the season as the running backs coach. It was reported he had I think it was 4 interviews, and maybe it's because of the Rooney Rule, but he's a guy who the Bills' offense had really not been playing well prior to him being promoted after the Bills fired Greg Roman. But Anthony Lynn has the resume to become a head coach, and we've seen this year with the Bills' offense running at almost a historic pace. And Tyrod Taylor's development as a quarterback. It's just an offense where they've been playing really well. Obviously, there's going to be guys. There's more Josh McDaniels and Matt Patricia, the Patriots coordinators. Personally, I'm not a big fan because neither guy has had that success outside of New England. That being said, they're 2 guys who have been around Bill Belichick and learned from one of the greatest coaches of all time. Other names I'll toss out, but I don't need to really say much on. Jim Bob Cooter, Jim Schwartz, Todd Haley, Leslie Frazier. Obviously, Paul Gunther could be an internal promotion, or Vance Joseph, the now Dolphins defensive coordinator after he was the defensive backs coach for a while in Cincinnati. Guys who I think will come up in conversation but won't be options. Obviously, you have the college coaches. I don't think the Bengals are going to hire anyone from college. The only guy I would really like is Jim Harbaugh, but even all these guys, Harbaugh, Saban, Urban Meyer, they're all comfortable where they are. I don't think they're going to try to make their way up to the NFL. Guys I think that should not be options but will come up in conversation: Tom Coughlin, John Gruden. Tom Coughlin's 71 years old, and I just don't understand how he would relate to a 23-year-old in an NFL locker room. And it's been 4 or 5 years since his Super Bowl, and I know people like his fiery personality, but ultimately I'm not one of the opinion that a fiery personality is what makes a head coach good. Generally, I look for being someone who's a hothead. And Gruden is, like with the college coaches, is comfortable where he's at. So I'm curious what you guys think of these guys. Obviously, what I say isn't just, don't take it as gospel like a lot of people take PFF's word for gospel. I mean, that's just my opinion. Do your own research. But there's a lot of legitimate coaching options out there. And there could be guys who get fired from maybe an incompetent organization who, could be potential a coaching candidate. Mike McCarthy's a very similar coach to Marvin Lewis, but he's had success and has won a Super Bowl. Ron Rivera, Bruce Arians, I don't think either one will get fired, but if they were, that's an immediate hire. Even guys like the Jets head coach Todd Bowles, I think would be an interesting fit. So there'll be a lot of intriguing options, but it's interesting to look around. I'll say that.
Scott, I think the only 2 people left off of Connor's list were you and I. And if you have a chance, by the way, Connor did a very nice write-up on a lot of those coaches and those candidates on Cincy Jungle, so check that out. Scott, any thoughts on some of those names thrown out there? Any of those on your wish list?
I think the one thing I would say is I would probably whittle his list down a little bit. Just looking at Mike Brown's history, the 4 head coaches that he's brought in since he got rid of Sam Weish have all been former coordinators. Dave Shula was offensive coordinator, I think, in Dallas. Bruce Kozlet was an offensive coordinator and former head coach. Dick LeBeau was a Bengals defensive coordinator and had been around. And Marvin Lewis had been defensive coordinator and also, I think, an assistant head coach for a year with the Redskins before he got hired. So I think if he brings anyone in, it's not going to be a college guy. Probably wouldn't be, a up-and-comer who isn't at the assistant level yet, but I think it's got to be either an offensive or defensive coordinator, and probably someone who has had a couple jobs, kind of worked his way up the ladder, someone who has a track record or resume. I think that's probably the only legitimate person he'd bring in. But as we said earlier, I'd be really surprised if he does bring someone in. It kind of reminds me of that G.K. Chesterton quote that how a good novel tells you about the hero, but a bad novel tells you about the author, which basically means if you're, if your coach is good, he's kind of like a long snapper. You don't really think about him, but you look at the result. So if the coach is good enough, you're just looking at what's happening on the field. But when your team's bad, you look at the coach because he's the easiest component to get rid of. So obviously I understand why a lot of people want to get rid of Marvin Lewis because, the team's struggling and you're looking at the author of that team. And that is obviously Marvin Lewis. But at the end of the day, I think that Mike Brown thinks that, no, he's still a good author. He's given us many good teams where we didn't have to think about Lewis. We didn't have to think about the lack of in-game adjustments, the kind of odd use of timeouts and challenges. We just look at, hey, they seem to be winning. Doesn't matter that they keep playing bad veterans over better younger people. We keep winning, and we're kind of happy with that. So, at the end of the day, I think it'll be a moot point, and unless something just truly bizarre happens, I'm going to say the most likely hire is the guy we have.
I liked all those names, and there was a couple that I didn't think of, Connor, that you brought up. But Todd Haley is an interesting one as well. That kind of piqued my interest a little bit. But you look at things. My pipe dream would be Jim Harbaugh. But you look at, we talked about the friction between an outspoken, fiery coach like Sam Weish and Mike Brown's early days as an owner. That you heard about Harbaugh and his supposed disagreements with 49ers management, even though he led them to massive success in a short window of time.
He'd be awesome.
He would be great, but I don't see it.
And he's so comfortable in Michigan right now. I don't think he's even gonna. I think the one thing I didn't really talk about is that the Bengals position is like one of the most desirable positions that will be open if it were to be open. They have a talented roster, an owner that's willing to give up control and support the coach and won't just give up on him after a season or two of bad seasons. That's a desirable opening, and so who knows? Maybe it does spark a guy like Harbaugh to interview for it. I just don't see it happening.
Yeah, and I don't know fully about the control aspect, but I do think about job security. I think that's definitely true, Connor. The one guy, and I know he was way down on your pecking order, the one guy I see, especially with Hugh Jackson seeming to at least make it, even regardless of how Cleveland finishes this year, it sounds like he's going to stay there for at least 2 or 3 years. Given what we heard about Jackson getting a supposed succession plan from Lewis, given the team's comfortability with Lewis's staff and a promote from within type of mentality per se, the guy I see is Vance Joseph. And even though he's not with the team currently, if you remember, he was with the team for 2 years. And after the 2014 season, Mike Brown actually made the decision to block Vance Joseph for defensive coordinator interviews after that season. And I don't remember exactly who was, because at that point he was a secondary coach. Yeah, he blocked him, and he didn't want him to leave. And I think obviously Lewis was probably in his ear at that point too. But he made the executive decision to say, "Hey, look, we're keeping him. He's not going to interview." But then the next year he said, "Okay, you know what? I blocked you for another year. You can, he's actually been a guy, for all of his criticisms, he's actually been a guy who's been generous with his coordinators and other guys to get interviews for other jobs and promotions elsewhere." So pat on the back to Mike Brown for that. But I think Vance Joseph, especially with the turnaround you saw from the Dolphins this year, midway through the season, I believe they're now 7-4. I think they were at one point 1-4, 1-3. And I think a big part of that has been the defense, as well as good play from Ryan Tannehill. But I think Vance Joseph, from a comfortability standpoint, you heard things earlier this year, a rumor about secondary players really missing Vance Joseph, as a secondary coach, and they really, really liked him. Some guys came out and said he was the best coach they ever had. I just see that being the fit if the Bengals were to make a move. And then also that would help, if Marvin does transition into maybe a front office role, that sort of thing. There's obviously a good working relationship there between Joseph and Lewis, so that just would make sense. The one caveat there would be Joseph overseeing Paul Gunther, who used to be his boss.
Exactly. That's kind of my one thing is if Brown wanted Gunther over Joseph to the point where he was willing to let Joseph walk, I mean, I would think that he would just promote Gunther to head coach if he really was picking between those two.
Right. But the other thing is, too, that we have to look at from a macro perspective is, if the Bengals make a change at head coach, not only staff changes, but also, as weird as it may sound, for all the Andy Dalton supporters, potentially some sort of quarterback change or philosophy change that could come with that. And that's a totally different topic for another time. But thank you guys for your opinions on this. It was great. Great topics, great questions from our listeners. Again, one last time, you can get in touch with us via Twitter at BengalsOBI, via email, theobinsider@gmail.com. You can subscribe to get all of our material on our SoundCloud and YouTube channels. You can also join us live on YouTube every week as we record this show. And you can also check out Cincy Jungle, not only for the material that we all put up as co-hosts of this show, but also this show is available to be streamed on that website as well. So check out all of our stuff through those platforms, as well as the stuff on Cincy Jungle. Gentlemen, let's get out of here. Hopefully the Bengals turn the tide this week, I guess, right?
I mean,
one thing I've noticed, we are 0-3 since Donald Trump won the election.
Oh, my.
And he seems to love tweeting. So since you mentioned our Twitter, maybe he can tweet something for us. Maybe fire the team up or something.
Make the Bengals great again.
Yes.
3 a.m. rant. Just they need a 3 a.m. rant from Donald Trump.
That's what we need. Make the Bengals great again. And on that note, folks, we will leave you. Thanks for tuning in, and thanks for downloading the show. Even though it's a rough season, hoo day.
Hoo day.